Hello and welcome to Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me is Mr. Chris Hellstrom. How are you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing good, Jody. How are you?
I'm alive.
Awesome.
It's better than being 6 feet under, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the way to go. Being alive is pretty good. Yeah. Awesome. How's your week been?
Well, adventurous. I finally upgraded to Catalina. And it's been...
Yeah, you brave soul, you.
It's been an adventure. But you know, it's time to be done. Everything pretty much that I use is Catalina compatible, except for a couple of things.
That's good.
Those couple of things don't really relate to what we're talking about, so we'll stop there.
There you go. Sounds good. Yeah, I always am doing a little bit of head scratching where people tend to, you see people on forums and things, and they go, oh yeah, I updated to insert whatever thing here, and they go, and now my system doesn't work, and I have to deliver a mix for a client today. I'm like, why are you updating? Yeah, you're in the middle of a project. Don't do that.
Yeah, dumb idea. Yeah. Note to all Inside the Recording Studio listeners, do not upgrade a major OS upgrade in the middle of projects. I was fortunately not in the middle of projects, so I could do it. And I'd spent extensive time researching, making sure everything I had, or almost everything I had, was compatible. Yeah. At least on the recording side, everything is, so I'm good there.
Right. Yeah, I mean, even if it's an instrument or anything like that, any plugin that you use, don't upgrade if you're in the middle of something. It's just asking for trouble, so bad idea.
That's the intro tip of the day.
Intro tip. There you go. Just the tip. Today we're talking
workflow for mixing. Yeehaw! Woo!
Yeah, and
jazz
almost more specifically, jazz hands. Visual jokes. So,
that's right. It's on the video if you don't have it on the podcast. Trust me, that was
hilarious. But we're talking how we might prepare to mix, not necessarily the nitty gritty of
mixing in and of itself. Yeah,
right. We'll probably do that a little bit more in
individual episodes when we talk about certain things.
Yeah, but so let's say in this, we'll do a case study here. I suppose. You have been given. Or let's say that you've actually been the engineer producer on this project, and you've recorded an artist, and it's now time to mix. Step one for Jody Whitesides, what do you do?
We're not done. We're done tracking, is what you're saying. It's time to mix.
Yeah, we're done tracking. It's time to start mixing.
Time to mix.
What do you do?
Well, being that I work from templates for tracking, all of my stuff is already color coded as it's already been tracked, which is nice.
Yeah, but let's come back to the color coding a little bit. But what do you do before?
Make sure that every channel strip is appropriately titled in my DAW. That's the very first thing I do. I go through and look at every single channel strip, know what's on it, and I label it appropriately first from the tracking template.
Right, but you do that even when you're tracking, don't you? So
that you're not it's a good idea to double check it before you're going to go to the next step.
Absolutely, but I don't think we mentioned that during any of the tracking episodes.
No, we didn't.
But
we're mentioning it now.
Right, but we should. It's it's nothing worse than seeing something and you get audio 1, audio 2, audio 3,
instrument 10.
Right, or
what is this thing?
Right, and especially if you're hunting for something.
Don't hunt; it's bad for the body.
So, so you're naming and you're thinking this for just so that when you're exporting your tracks, moving them into your mix template.
That is correct.
You want to make sure everything is titled accordingly.
Named. Yes.
Right.
So, and the other thing I tend to do, like if it's drums, every drum gets the precursor of drum.
Okay.
And then drum kick, drum snare, drum hi-hat, drum shaker, drum whatever. Anything that's related to drums gets the precursor of drums in the title.
Right.
Same thing with guitars. All the guitars get guitar and then the title of what it is, if it's electric and some particular sound, or if it's acoustic and whether it's the mic or the director or what have you. All those get precursors of the actual groupings that they are. So if it's drums, there's guitars, there's synths, there's vocals and whatever else you'd like to precursor a group of things with. That's the first thing I double check on all my channel strips.
And you do that just so that you can keep things a little bit neatly organized in the Finder on your drive, that type of thing?
Well, it's not only for the Finder, but it's also for when I import it into the mix template, it's automatically named and I don't have to worry about it at that point. And then I can just group everything according to their group names and then slowly, rearrange them in the arrange page if I have to.
Yeah. So I think that would probably be a little bit dependent on which DAW you're using, where I know Logic imports the names if you just drag in a file, that kind of thing. But anyway, the bottom line here is to
be
keep organized.
Yes.
Yeah, keep organized.
Organization. Very nice there.
Right. And that doesn't mean they have to write an essay in every, track name, right? But if
I do. Track
but you
notes.
do in your notes,
Yes.
but that's a different story. But I'm saying in the track name, it doesn't have to be, this is guitar, lead guitar, Marshall amp with the melody line on top.
Oh, no, that's not the title. That's in the notes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all in the notes.
Right.
Definitely notes. Yeah, definitely.
And
definitely
it helps
notes.
with everything. Yeah. So now you got your, but even before you start importing into your, or maybe you do that as you've imported into your mix template.
And that is?
Well, I was going to ask you about what's your process for going through and fixing tracks, cleaning up like little breaths in vocals, or it might be, hunting down issues, anything that can be there.
Issues, yeah.
Where there's timing correction or...
All that's done in the tracking template, yes. So prior to exporting tracks to the mix template, after everything's appropriately named, go through with making sure that each individual track is clean of extraneous noise that does not belong.
Right.
So that could include using things like Isotope's RX plugin platform for removing on vocals, mouth noises, breaths, if they're overly loud kind of thing, and they don't necessarily need to be. Spectral denoise if the background of a track is particularly noisy because it wasn't recorded in a great environment. Mm-hmm. Spectral denoise is a great plugin to be able to remove the background noise while retaining all of the musical character of what's going on. Yeah. So that's a good thing to run if it's overly noisy. Just looking for clicks and pops and other things that don't belong and making sure that they are duly taken care of before they are sent to the mix phase.
Right. So anything, if there's any comping and edits or anything like that, that's all done before that.
Vocals, if it's needed, all timing corrections are all done in before. That's kind of like the last phase before you start exporting tracks, for me anyway. Yeah. Yeah. I'm assuming it's the same for you.
Yeah. It's very similar. I have to, sometimes I'm quite bad at that if it's my own stuff.
It's mine. It's already perfect. Why do I need to do that?
Yeah, no, I don't mean in that way. I mean in the sense that I have to try to stay disciplined, and it depends a little bit on what it is I'm doing. Actually, what I'm composing for, writing for. But if it's more of, let's say, it's not production music, it's not anything like that. It's
you mean artistic stuff?
Artistic stuff, then I would very much try to adhere to that. I try to stay disciplined and make sure, because it's not just for, you and I have talked about this before, it's not just for having a clean template to start mixing with less issues, and you can go out of that, but it's also a little bit for backup purposes.
Yes, very much so.
You have all the clean files essentially right there for you, and you don't have to worry about
if a plugin manufacturer stops making that plugin.
Yeah, exactly. That has happened
multiple times.
Yeah.
Yes.
Ooh, that synth doesn't exist anymore. I wonder what that sounded like. That does happen. But the reason I say this, I try to be better about it. But when I do sometimes like library work, the turnaround tends to be a little bit quicker, and sometimes it's just simpler to kind of mix in the same project, and
sure,
it works quite fine. But the process is very much similar. I just won't export into
a mix template.
Mix template, yeah.
And just to note, in terms of library stuff, I'm the same way. I will mix in the template that I've built for library productions, just because it's an ease of use thing. So
yeah,
and you've seen that template. It's kind of crazy.
It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. If you
saves a ton of time.
Yeah, it's world championship in bus routing. So, but
if there's an award, I might win it.
Oh, you'd be up for it. That's for sure. Yeah. Enough buses to make Michael Brower blush, right?
That would be fun.
Right.
And if you don't know who Michael Brower is, Google him.
Yeah. Amazing person. One thing I wanted to touch on as we're talking about this prepping for track or prepping tracks for mixing.
Yes.
And this is something that can be a little bit touchy when you're working with other clients.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's say that you're getting a project to mix from somebody, and there are a lot of issues with the track. Let's say that they're poorly edited. There's noises. There's all this kind of thing. What is your process for that? I mean, this is a little bit more of a business type of issue, but
communication.
I'm sorry?
Communication.
Yeah, but I would then go to the client and say, look, I can fix all these issues for you, but that's
within
not
reason.
part of it. Right. Well, yeah, but to the best of my ability, but that's not part of the budget that I gave you to mix the track.
Right. That's all part of communication, and that's not something that I would wait to bring up until I heard something. It's something that I would mention prior to hearing the audio.
Very good.
That way that if it's like brought up and they get the audio, they've already heard the fact that if like, hey, if the audio's in this quality or condition, more money is either needed or you might need to find somebody else if you can't afford it.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because I'll turn down that kind of work if they're not willing to pay for it because it's not worth my time.
Sure. Yeah, because they say, no, it's fine. And the product comes out and it's got your name on it and it sounds like garbage with all this kind of stuff. It reflects poorly on you as well.
Yes.
Now, ultimately, it's not your project. It's the artist's project. However,
your name is attached and you're riding that carpet.
Right. So that's something that I tend to speak to people beforehand.
Yes.
Like even if before I get the audio. Like, This is
gotta mention.
This is my price. This is what I charge per mix. If I need to spend time, fixing, tuning vocals, time correcting drums, whatever it is, there will be this charge attached to it.
Extra cost. That's right. Takes time.
So
time is money.
Right. And but it's I think you make the client think a little bit more about that kind of thing, just the quality of the tracking and also managing expectations.
Yes, that's the big thing in workflow. If you're working for other clients, you have to manage expectations.
Right.
There's only so much magic you can work, I think.
Yes. Yeah. So that's something important to bring up because it can be, to do it well. I mean, there's a lot of great tools, like you mentioned, like RX, and there's Melodyne that we talked about in the past, or
Vocal Line, or all kinds of things.
Yeah, but it still requires you to
know the tool and be able to use it.
Right, and it is time consuming.
It is.
And it can be frustrating. It's not like everybody's great at doing this kind of stuff, right? But and
it's not like the software, when run in automatic mode, does a perfect job either.
Yes.
That's something that's heavily needed to be mentioned in the process of getting ready for mixing stuff and you're trying to fix up tracks. Oftentimes people will just go, I'll just do it with the automatic button or whatever it is that they use. And then it's like they do everything and it comes out still with artifacts and weird, crazy sounds in there because you weren't using your ears to help fix whatever it is you're trying to fix. And things can be fixed within reason, but at the same time, you need to use your ears to make sure it's doing a good job.
Yeah. And also on that note, using your ear when, let's say that you're time correcting stuff, it's very, very easy to start listening with your eyes, and you're just looking at the grid and like, oh, that's a little bit early, but does it sound early or late? So use your ear and don't necessarily think that everything has to line up exactly properly if it sounds right. It's not a visual thing.
That's right.
It's an audio thing.
Use your ears. Hand-eye coordination, hand-ear coordination.
Something like that.
Or ear-eye coordination. Ear first. Hearing.
Yes. Take care of your ears.
That's right.
So now we got clean tracks.
And they're ready to go.
Mix. They're imported into...
Well, they haven't quite been imported because they haven't been exported yet, right? Because we talk about going from template to template. At least that's the thing that we're kind of going with a workflow thing outside of production music here. There's a step that happens before you're ready to import into a mix template, and that is you have to export those tracks.
Sure.
Well, you don't have to. I mean, it's a good idea to do it. I do individual tracks for everything that's going out, whether it's a mono track or a stereo track that starts from the 0 point of the template,
right,
and goes to the end of the track. Same bar. So everything's all lined up from the beginning of the bar, not from where it was technically recorded.
Yeah, so guitar comes in on the second verse, but you're going to bounce that from downbeat
0
to 1.
or 1, downbeat to 1. That way, all your tracks line up. And that is a good tip for future-proofing. Say that 10 times fast, right? So that if you go into another DAW, you can just bring all the tracks in and not have to worry about them not lining up. Or if the DAW that you use is suddenly... new version doesn't import old versions, or you don't have the old version anymore, you won't know where things are placed in time, and you'll be troubled and confused and upset and angry that you didn't start everything from 1 for your mix stuff. Yeah, to make your mixing easier.
I've gotten files like that. That's always fun. When does this? No, it's not. It's horrible.
There's never an instance where this is fun.
A foolproof way of if you're switching between DAWs.
Yeah.
Let's say that,
DAW to DAW.
No, I'm not going to mix this project. I'm just tracking it, and somebody else is using Pro Tools or Cubase or whatever happens to be. Same thing works there, right? What's your process then? Let's say that during the tracking phase and there's been a certain kind of reverb on a guitar or a synth or something like that. Do you tend to print that, or do you do the route where you go, if it's a part of the sound or you're going, it needs to have this delay on it, let's say that you're doing like a U2 type of a thing, do you generally print just with the effects as a stereo track, or do you do one dry and one with?
That's a good question. The answer that I would give is it is dependent upon the part and how integral it is or needed to be before the mix phase. Because if you don't have it wet prior to the mix, you can do a lot more with it in the mix.
So you're saying it's program dependent?
It's program dependent.
Cheers.
That's right. Cheers, everyone. Take your shot.
Right. So in other words, if it's, I think that's a pretty good example. Let's say that it's a YouTube kind of part where there's delay parts on the guitar that are definitely going to be there.
Yes.
I would definitely print those. But one thing to keep in mind is that perhaps levels might need to change. So it's always a good practice to have, almost like we talked about tracking a DI on the bass and all this kind of stuff, having it dry.
Having the
guitar
clean
track.
Original version that is unaffected is a good way to get into a mix that may need help in the mix phase, whether it's an EQ thing or a level thing between the original and the delayed signal. It's a lot easier to control it when you have the original and or the effect rather than the original and the effect at the same time that you can't modify afterwards. That's just my personal preference.
I agree. And that goes a little bit against also the philosophy that we talked about before,
which is
like, commit to the sound.
Well, you commit to the sound, but you can transfer it from the tracking to the mixing.
Yeah, no, I agree. And hopefully 9 times out of 10, you end up using just that wet file and you'll be fine. But in those cases where you're like, oh man, that's a little too wet, or it's difficult to dial that back. So you wish you had the dry signal.
Yes.
So that's the exporting, and the same thing obviously with vocals.
It's not the entire thing. So with exporting, one of the things that I do, knowing whether I've imported or if I tracked it or whatever, I'll have the notes of like my exporting chops of what I do. So there's going to be a step of treating it like it's going through a console before it goes to the mix phase. Does that make sense? I might have tracked it that way, but I might also send it to the mix again. So it's dependent on how it was tracked. If I know that it didn't have a little bit of compression and a little bit of maybe massageable EQ in there, and maybe I want to get a particular sound of a board, whether it's an SSL, because we're talking digital representations of these things at this point rather than the going from one studio to another. It's almost like you're going from one studio to another if you change the type of board that you're sending it through. So in a hardware world, or prior to the digital revolution, if you tracked in one studio, that studio might have an API board. Then if you go and mix in another studio, it might have an SSL board. So I treat that functionality between the two. I think, okay, if I tracked in this one, what do I want to send it to the mix sounding like? So I actually will run my exports of my individual tracks through a pre-mix phase of maybe I add a little compression or a little bit of EQ, and then I add, maybe a board emulation at the end of that so that it sounds like it went through that board as I was going to the mix. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah.
So I'm adding the stage of like what it would be like if I was using that gear in real life rather than just staying 100% pristine digital, so to speak. From step to step.
When you're bouncing the track or exporting that track, you're adding the emulation on top of it, just as you would. So that, and just as you would with, let's say that you've had guitar amp simulations, you would print that simulation, so you're not getting just the straight DI. You're getting, no, this is the sound that we're committed to.
This is the sound that I'm committing to as I'm going to the mix. Yes, that is the process right after the naming and the cleaning and all that kind of stuff. I'm now exporting my tracks with the sounds that are going to my mix template.
Right.
As I bounce each track.
Mm-hmm. And anything else that I wanted to add to that? No, I think that's, I think I would
lost
just
for
echo
words. So unlike
you. Well, I was just trying to think if there was another step or anything to think about there, but I think you kind of covered that, where you're committing to the sound, but you're giving yourself options at the mix stage as well.
Yes.
But things like console emulation and possibly tape emulation, would you add at that stage as well? Yeah. So all of that kind of stuff.
All that happens at that stage.
Right. Okay.
And tape is always the last one.
Yeah. You don't experiment with that type of thing and just see?
Well, I suppose I have, but I've learned that tape is the last step. It's the same thing in a real life situation.
You're thinking what it would be in reality.
In reality, tape is always the last step. So you're tracking to the tape after you've already done compression and EQ and whatever other things, and you're going into the board, and then it's relating from the board in that regard. So when it comes back, it's coming from tape. So yeah, it's just the last thing that ends up going to the bounced out audio.
Right. Gotcha.
Yeah.
No, that's that's similar to what I do as well. So now.
Oh, and the other thing to probably mention is gain staging is important along that whole line.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So
right.
Yeah.
This is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine.
Here comes pets.
Well,
and
no,
peeves.
just the way I understand it, or the way I wrap my head around it. There's a lot of talk about gain staging.
Yes.
And I think
it floats everywhere.
Yeah. And I think the thing is to what it means to me. I could care less where whatever software I have that goes like, oh, it's an emulation of an old LA2A. It's supposed to receive this kind of signal, whatever it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think gain staging is just to make sure that you have a similar type of volume on the input of each track, and not necessarily that it's going to sit there in the mix, but if you have everything in sort of like the rough similar area where you kind of have an average level at a comfortable level, I suppose, it makes it so much easier to mix. Where if you have like, well, here's one guitar and that's peaking at -6, and then you have another guitar that's peaking at -20.
Yeah, it's like, that's problematic.
Right. So it just makes your job a lot trickier to do that kind of thing. So,
sure.
So that's what gain staging means to me, to have everything at a sort of like an average level going out. And you don't have to, this is one that probably gone a little bit these days, but certainly in the beginning of digital, there would be a lot of sort of like mental hangovers from tracking the tape and analog consoles where you have to keep everything just up until it clips type of thing. You got to have that super, but that's not true anymore.
Right.
Yeah. So it's almost the opposite, because you've got so much headroom now, and the signal to noise ratio is
insane.
Yeah. So keep your input levels and your output levels at, even though there's a lot more headroom going on in DAWs these days, but that's not the point here. But you
what
keep
is the point?
Is that you don't have to track and going into where you're tickling in the red.
Tickling in the red.
Yeah, you certainly don't want to clip on the input stage, because it's nasty sounding.
That's right. Input distortion can be nasty. Can be real nice. Well, in digital forms, it can be real nasty.
Yeah.
In analogs, it's kind of
then it's just distortion, right? That's like,
distortion.
Nice and creamy.
Love it.
I guess that the code word for that is vibe.
And it also, the reality comes down to, if it sounds good, it is good, right?
Sure. Yeah, but digital clipping rarely sounds good.
Yeah, digital clipping rarely is. It's mostly assy.
Yeah, so those are my thoughts on like gain staging. Do you want to add anything to that, or do you?
The thing I think I would add is that if you're using vintage emulation type softwares, there is a point of like how much level you feed something before it hits a sweet spot. If you go below that, then it's not quite getting to the sweet spot, and if you go above that in terms of volume levels where you're hitting the plugin, it can create odd distortions beyond the sweet spot. I had somebody come to me and say, oh, I've been using this tape emulation and I can't get it to sound good. And I said, well, what kind of volumes are you running into it, and how are you dealing with it? Well, I just and knowing that he was pressing the volume because he's wanting his mix to sound really loud. It's like, well, that's not the trick to getting the mix to sounding loud. And because you've never worked with tape, you don't understand the concept of how tape works, I'm guessing, because you can saturate it, but at a certain point, if you're pushing the plug-in too hard, you're going to get noise. And that's not the noise that you want. At least that's as it was being described to me. So I started mentioning gain staging. It's like you have to make sure that the volume coming into a plug-in is probably equal to what's going out, and not being too much or too little in the middle of what that plug-in's doing.
Right. No,
unless you're really trying to experiment in the great beyond of whatever.
Sure. But from my perspective, I agree with that. I agree with what you're saying, that there's a certain point where it sounds good, and there's a certain point where it sounds awful. You're not getting the desired result. Yeah. But my point being that to me, it's less about how the original piece of gear would react.
Sure.
And more getting the desired result. And like you said too, it's very easy to get fooled by things like compression, where, oh, it sounds so much better, but in reality, it's just louder.
Yeah.
So it's, and those are really important things to kind of keep track of. But again, it comes back down to listening to what it is that you want, right? And if you're, I'm sending -6 into this thing and it's spinning out, -12. It's like, well, what happened to my sound? Well, maybe there's something going on there that's not, right. So it's just keeping track of that. But I like the idea of when you're tracking and certainly when you're bouncing out things to into your mix template to have a fairly steady volume on each track coming out, or level on each track, where you have something that's manageable to start with.
Sure. Yeah. If you got if you were sent a project where all of the track stems or track bounces were all at, say, 0, it might make mixing a little bit tough.
Yeah.
Unmanageable, they might say.
Yeah.
Whereas my own personal preference is to attempt to track most things peaking around -18, -15 max, period.
Yeah.
For everything. Well, drums are a little bit different. They usually tend to peak a little bit further beyond that, but generally speaking, -18 to -15 dB, and that makes the mix go so much easier. Much easier.
Yeah. I tend to go a little bit hotter than that, but not a whole lot. I might, let's say I would go -12 to -8, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all, what you get used to doing here and keeping your level, but that you keep that sort of thing, that sort of mindset across the board, I think is a good place to start.
Pick your level and stick to it. Just don't make it 0 and red.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah. There's a bumper sticker. Don't make it 0 or red.
Yeah.
Okay. So everything is bounced out, mono where it needs to be, stereo where it needs to be. Time to import and start organizing your session.
Yes.
So this is something that helped me a whole lot, and I think you as well.
Okay.
And that is color coding and grouping your tracks.
Yes, color coding.
Yeah,
Love
big
it.
fan, and it makes it sound so much better.
Yes, it improves the sound quality by at least 10%.
Right, and that's not in my mind at all. No. In all seriousness, it just keeps you
focused.
Right, and you see exactly what's going on in your session. So, you have a certain, color for drums, which for me is yellow.
Yeah, we both use the same color coding scheme, don't we?
Pretty much, for the most part, I think, yeah. But the idea isn't that you have to use a certain color, obviously, but it's just pick one and stick to it, because now you go back to every project and you can quickly see where things are. And I also like to keep things in the same order in my arrange page, where for me, I keep drums on top.
Yep.
Bass, which is
next
brown.
to below the drums, yeah.
Yeah.
If it's a vertical arrangement, yeah.
Right. Unless there's percussion elements, which are a lighter hue of yellow. But they would be below the drums. I would have the bass afterwards, which for me is brown. After that comes guitars, which are blue, obviously. Acoustic guitars would be on top of that. If there are any, I would do those again at a slightly different blue. Then keyboards, which are green. And I would even separate, depends on, this is a little bit different if I'm doing more library stuff as well. If there's melodic elements to that, I will have those in a different color as well, just so I can kind of keep those separate. Vocals after that, backing vocals after that. If I have any, again, this is a little bit more for...
You didn't mention what color you're doing those vocals in.
Red. Obviously.
Yes. The fire of the song.
And I do a slightly different hue again for background vocals. And it just makes everything so much easier, because if I always have that same order, it's a lot easier to navigate the mix.
Yes.
And keep everything there.
I concur.
And then if
I'm
there's
not
any
going to
additional
disagree
stuff,
with any of that. Same colorings, same arrangement from top to bottom in terms of organization. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
yes.
Yeah. And
I want more of what you're having.
A little coffee. I'll have a little rocket fuel here.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry about that. So yeah, it just makes, and another thing that I do that has helped me as well when it comes to the mixing is all grouped tracks, whether it being drums, and I'll come back to drums, but let's say bass, guitars, vocals, all that kind of thing, will be sent to their own bus.
Yep.
So there will be a drum bus, there will be a bass bus, even if it's only one track.
Yeah,
I still
even
like
if
to
it's
do
one,
that.
still gets its own little bus.
Yeah, guitars, vocals, backing vocals. Yeah. Again, because it just makes it a little bit easier. And there are things that where if I have in the mix and let's say I'm doing something for a client, there's a bunch of automation going on the vocal track, let's say. Not entirely unheard of, right? But then I go, okay, well, I need to bring it down 2 dB. Instead of changing all the notes, I would just go on the bus and bring it down and that kind of thing.
Yep, makes it simple that way.
Yeah, and sometimes that you and I have done as well with the additional routing there would be to send all the instruments to a music bus and all the vocals
to
a vocal bus.
That's
and then
right. Your instruments do not ride with your vocals. Your vocals do not ride with your instruments. They are divas in and of themselves on both counts.
Right.
Just kidding.
So
yeah, but that's not even a sometimes thing. That's an all the time thing. That's a separation that happens all the time in every mix for me.
Yeah. For you, yeah. I do it most of the time. Depends a little bit on what I'm doing, obviously, or who I'm mixing for. But it makes it so much easier when you, let's say that the client can I have an instrumental mix of this as well?
Yeah, real simple. Just hit mute on the vocal bus and boom, you've got an instrumental mix.
Yeah, as opposed to just muting the vocal and the background vocal bus.
The 35 vocal tracks and everything else going on and all the effects. Yeah, that becomes problematic.
So it's just, and I think both of us sort of arrived at that kind of method by encountering issues in the past where it's like everything is going to the master bus and so, okay, but now I have to do that. And now I have to remember to mute the guitar delay that's going to the master and blah, 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 all this kind of thing. So that's worked pretty well for both of us, I think. Other people do different things, but that's how we tend to do it.
Yeah, it works really well for me.
Yeah, and
makes it easy to make all the alternate mixes that someone needs when it comes to licensing things, or they just want to have a karaoke version of themselves. So you do a no lead vocal mix or a vocal up or a vocal down. Having that final bus allows you to make easy adjustments for all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So now
we will probably show like how we do that in a future episode.
Sure. Yeah.
We'll talk about it.
Right. That would be a good one. So, everything is imported. Everything has been exported from the tracking template. We now have it hopefully color coded. Everything is named what it's supposed to be. Color coded, routed to their appropriate buses. We're ready to start mixing. Right?
Yeah. Yeehaw! So we're ready now. Let's go.
If it's not one of your tracks, which assumingly you'd be reasonably familiar with, what's your first step? I mean, we're not going into the nitty gritty here, but what's the first thing that you might do?
Depending on the volume of the consistency or as the staging that we're talking about, where it's hitting, I will adjust the input or the channel strip faders.
Yeah.
So that everything's at a uniform volume that I can hear, where it's not going to clip my output kind of thing to start.
Right. Yeah.
And just kind of get a sense of the song, just of all the individual or all the tracks kind of together. And then at that point I go, okay, I make my little mental notes and then I mute everything but the drums and I start there. Then I add the bass.
Yeah. Okay. So, but let's backtrack a little bit there, because you said you keep everything at same level, or the faders at a certain level.
All the faders at a certain level, yeah.
And now it's really important that everything has been gain staged so that you can kind of hear everything in the way that they're the way that they're tracked. So that
Sure.
if something is tracked too low, if you have everything there, you're not going to hear everything. And then you have to start finding out where things are. So that's another thing where I think that gain staging helps when you just like, you getting into that and you kind of do that. So, okay. So you start with the drums.
Yeah. Most of the time.
Have
It's
that
your rhythmic
solid
foundation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Make sure those sound great. Then I bring in the bass and I mix in the level there and make sure it works in conjunction with the kick and things of that nature. After that, I probably will start, if there's guitars, I'll start adding the guitars, and then whatever the main driving rhythmic instruments and, chordal instruments are, just kind of add them as I go. And then I finish off with the vocals and really spend a lot of time on the vocals once I get there.
Right.
But some people start it. The other thing too is it kind of depends a little bit upon a program, or the song, as to what I'm going to start with. If it's really a vocal oriented song, I'll start with the vocal and bring everything else in to support that.
Yeah.
Rock is more where I'm going to start. Rock and pop is where I'm starting more with the rhythmic elements and the drums and stuff, and bringing things in that way. But as I'm doing it, just adding everything and making sure that the instruments aren't getting too out of hand before I get to the vocal, knowing that the vocal's coming in at a certain point.
As far as like level and frequency wise, no, that pretty much is how I do it most of the time as well. Just like you touched on, it depends on if it's a song where I kind of ask myself, well, what is it? What are the three things that are the most important thing in this song?
Yeah.
And for, drums is pretty much always going to be one of them. Right?
If there are drums, yeah. If there aren't, then it's not important.
But because that tends to be the energy, and that's where a lot of stuff happens. And more often than not, it would also be the vocal, right?
Yeah, for sure. The vocals are always like the super important thing. That's the connection to the audience, more or less, more often than not, is that vocalist or the vocal that's happening for the song, provided it has vocals. If it's instrumental, well, then that's a whole different thing. It's the instrument that's the shining factor.
Yeah. And then filling in the blanks there, what is it? Is it the bass that drives the song? Is it a guitar? Is it a keyboard thing? And have those, making those decisions that these are going to be the stars of the track.
Or
and
at a
then,
given point,
right. So I think when it's a song that you're getting from a client that you may not be familiar with, those first impressions are really important. When you listen to it the first time, because that's when things can really get an honest overview of what it is. It's like, wow, that was really cool, or this is, I really, really like this. Let's enhance that, as opposed to thinking, you know what, that notch filter on that keyboard sounds a little bit weird, and you get lost in the details when you're too familiar with it. So listening to that and just having that sort of like honest listening, I suppose, is valuable when you do that, and trust that. So that's when before you start losing perspective on things, when you start tweaking. And I think listening to things as well is before you start just diving into, I'm just going to add compression and EQ on everything. Well, does it really need it?
Yeah, that becomes your mixed taste kind of thing. Does it need it? Are you doing something that's actually enhancing the situation, or are you taking away from the situation by adding things that don't necessarily need to be there?
Yeah. Or are you just doing it because you can.
Do it. Yeah. I have this tool, I must use it. No, not necessarily.
No, it's a real thing. So, like I said, this purpose of this particular episode is not necessarily to go, you always have to do this and this and this, and this is how I always EQ my kick or whatever. But that first impression, getting everything up, listening to what you have, is a great place to start when you mix, and then you see if there are any issues that you might have to solve with frequency masking or anything like that.
Yeah, it's that point of where you're listening and you're trying to channel what is the spirit of this song.
Yeah.
How do I make it enhance itself?
Yeah. And important here as well is, if it's not our own stuff, that we're mixing.
You have to know what the client wants in the spirit of their song.
Yeah, I just had something recently where there on my part there had been a little bit of miscommunication, and
see, it comes back to that communication thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the mix notes I got back is we're talking about toms here. And he said, I want less Def Leppard and more Fleetwood Mac. So I thought that was brilliant. Okay, all right, awesome. But that's you need to have those conversations beforehand, or at least even if the client doesn't necessarily know.
Yeah. Don't take it personal.
No, it's not about me. It's about, just me helping the artist
serving the song.
Yeah,
you are the song's servant when you are mixing,
or at least the clients.
Well, there's two,
yeah. So that comes in with communication with the client, obviously, and you have to figure, okay, well, what's the best way to do that? So if they're going, I'm going for let's say a throwback kind of indie Strokes kind of vibe, right? Okay, well, maybe dial back a little bit on the big reverbs and the gated toms and all this kind of stuff, because that's not the way to go with this track. Maybe go a little bit heavier on that parallel distortion chain or whatever it happens to be.
Sure.
So as a last kind of thing here, I guess, do you have any particular sends and things already set up in your mix template that you tend to go to all the time, or do you go as need only?
There is only one.
And what is that?
That is a parallel drum bus compression channel strip that feeds immediately into the music bus for the instrumentals, or for the instruments bus. That's the only thing I have preset up, and the only reason why it's preset up is it's loaded with about 8 different types of compressors. And the reason for doing that is I tend to almost, like literally 98% of the time, run my drums through the parallel drum bus compressor to give a lot more weight to them when they're needed. And a lot of times they're really needed.
And then you
choose which compressor seems,
right?
kind of dial it in, feed it in, and pick which compressor gives it the right vibe for the song in that regard. Aside from that, everything else is on I need this now, let's create one for it.
Yeah.
That's the only one that's really pre-created.
Yeah. I find myself reaching for similar things a lot of times. So up until now, I've basically been doing it the way that you said it, minus the parallel bus. I don't have one of those in my template. But things that I tend to add a lot are, I tend to have some kind of room reverb, just to add a little bit of ambiance if it's there. I also tend to have a plate for vocals, a plate reverb, and some kind of verb for generally snare and toms to give a little bit of space. So in my updated mix template, I would more than likely add those.
Right.
But also things that if there are lead guitars, that kind of thing, I would probably add a little bit more of maybe a quarter note delay or something like that can be there for some melodies and things. So I might have those ready to go as well. But one thing that we should probably bring up as well, if I have, or I will bring up.
Do it.
If I have, let's say, okay, so I got a vocal plate that is just for vocals. I will not route the output of that to the main out. I would route it to the vocal,
to the bus,
to the vocal bus. So that's all packaged neatly in there, and I tend to not share those things. The only thing I might share is if there's a room that I tend to like to use, but I use that very, very sparingly. It's just to kind of give a little bit of width to something that might be really, really dry, especially if it's a guitar track or something like that. You just a little bit of ambience in there. So if you find that you're using the same type of reverb or delay or anything like that, anything special that you tend to do, like your parallel drum bus, it's a good idea to have that in your mix template as well, because it just saves you that workflow and you know what's there. Oh, that's always on send. Insert your favorite number here.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And then we're off to happy mixing.
Happy mixing. That's where we all want to be. Happy mixing.
Ideally, yes.
Ideally.
And when you're mixing, just as an A-side to kind of maybe wrap this up a little bit, is I would recommend that don't be too precious with your mixes. If you find that you're mixing and you just can't get that sound that you want, don't be afraid to start over. Sometimes
scrap it.
Yeah, just scrap it. Bring the faders down and just start over, and start
all
muting
the effects
things,
off.
all that kind of stuff. And it's amazing how
new perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So I think for our 2-minute Tuesday tip that will coincide with this particular episode, I suppose what we'll have is the color coding scheme.
Sure.
We'll have like a
that
visual
would be a
representation so people can see that.
Yeah. And then in a future one, we'll have that bus routing you do for your library stuff.
Oh, good
blow
Lord,
everybody's mind.
Where everybody's like, their brains are going to start spilling out of their ears.
Wait, it's going where and what, why? Yeah.
How?
And
what?
Yeah. So there we go. So that's how both of us kind of set up and get prepared to mix.
Well, getting into the mix. Yes.
Getting into the mix. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Well, with that, I'm going to say, see you later, Chris.
See you later, Jody. Have a wonderful rest of the day, all right?
Yes, and for everyone out there and inside the recording studio land, we will see you in the next episode.
And thank you for listening.